Marcantonio, did I pronounce it right?
Perfect.
Great. Yeah, if you could just talk to me just a little bit, and I'm just going to check the levels here.
Marcantonio is the most traditional of Roman names. And Marcantonio was Caesar's bodyguard and the only true love of Cleopatra.
If you could just move it slightly so we just get a tiny bit more of you in the frame, that would be brilliant.
So you mean...
I guess lower. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's more that you've got a light side and a dark side, so if we can brighten up the dark side in any way.
Is that the dark?
That's the dark, yes.
Hello and welcome to Sketch Notes on a Pandemic. I'm Lucy Johnston, Health and Social Affairs Editor of the Sunday Express. Today we're delighted to welcome a leading expert on addiction and coping, Professor Marcantonio Spada, who will be talking to us today about COVID-19 anxiety syndrome. What led you to characterize this particular syndrome?
At the beginning of the pandemic, official beginning, maybe February, March, Professor Anna Nikshevich and I were concerned that some of the behaviors that we may acquire during the pandemic to keep us safe, such as avoidance, or, for example, checking if other people are ill, or washing or cleaning products we may have bought at the time from local stores, that some of these habits that were sort of keeping us safe might end up persisting beyond a reasonable time frame, i.e., when the risk of the virus recedes to a point where it's completely non-significant, but we continue to avoid, or we continue to worry or check compulsively the news or pay attention to other people sneezing or coughing around us. And we thought at the time that that would be the biggest problem psychologically, because the threat and the anxiety and the fear we believed would be transient, but present last year. And we thought at the time this could be the legacy, the psychological legacy.
How do we know what point there is a threat that doesn't require this sort of checking? What levels should we expect now? What levels should we have expected back in March and throughout? What would you consider normal?
So it's obviously risk profiles are individual, but if we looked at the data that has come through over the last 12, 14 months, we've gone from a 3% infection to fatality rate, I think by the World Health Organization, postulated by the World Health Organization in March last year, to something that is much lower and clearly sort of varies by demographic. So sticking to what the data looks now, if you're under the age of 60, 55, 60, the chance of dying from COVID is not very different from the regular flu.
Is that post-vaccination? Are you talking about post-vaccination?
I am post-vaccination. We have to still see, because the trials for vaccines and their effectiveness will last for several years. But we understood over the last 12 to 14 months that the infection to fatality rate was very different across demographic groups. So a 40 or 50-year-old has a very small chance of dying of COVID. And we now know this maybe better than we knew in March, April, May last year. Post-vaccination, we're told that the chances of dying are even smaller than that. So the question that remains in my mind, well, if you're vaccinated and you are part of a pretty broad demographic, let's say under the age of 65 or 70, why would you continue to avoid? How much more worrying would you need to do to be safe? How much more checking is required to avoid dying? And so I think in view of the data we've got, infection to fatality, in view of the levels of vaccination, I think the avoidance, the worry, the check-in, the attention to threat are becoming redundant. And if they're still there, the question then is, why are they still there?
Yeah. So, I mean, two questions there. Firstly, are there any predicting factors? Is it the people who are most at risk who are doing these avoidance checking, ruminating things, worrying about the virus, or is it less predictable? Do you know what sort of people are doing it?
Yeah, so we've run several studies, as you and I know, because we talked about them in the past, and we've got lots of new data, which is coming in 3 weeks' time. The pattern seems to be the same. It tends to be those who are at higher risk, those who are younger, which is counterintuitive, those who are more health anxious, and those who've experienced a loss. So the experiencing of a loss, the presence of a sort of tendency towards health anxiety, and being at higher risk makes sense, as predictors. The emergence of being younger as a predictor, consistent. This factor has been a consistent factor throughout all our studies, our 5 studies over the last year, is an unusual one, because one would expect those who are older to be, displaying these forms of unhealthful coping.
Do you think it's?
But it's actually.
Yeah, well, there is a fear of long COVID and getting very ill and not being able to breathe. So you talk about the risk of dying, and I don't know whether that's not disputable. The risk of dying in the under 60s is what is a similar. I don't know. Don't dare similar to flu. People get very angry when you say that. But is it about that? The IFR infection.
So sorry.
The risk of dying for people under 60, you're saying, does not warrant this kind of behavior. Is that the?
Yeah, I mean, people will argue, is it under 60 or is it under 50? If we believe what we're told, that the infection to fatality rate is a lot less sort of extreme than we thought in March or April last year.
Yeah.
And on top of that, we've got a vaccination program, then it's difficult to argue for a 30 or 40 or 50-year-old, or maybe even 60-year-old, that it's difficult to argue to continue to be avoidant, and to continue to worry.
What about
with respect to high risk, however? So yes, those who display the avoidance, the worry, the syndrome, are those who are higher risk. So diabetes or pregnant women, etc.
Yeah, but not necessarily. It's not so clear cut. It's not just the risk factors that predicate you to the avoidance factors. And you don't think this is? I mean, I'm now going to sort of bury into why. Do you think it's because of a fear of the illness, which looks pretty nasty? Fear of long COVID, which people have made quite a lot of. We don't really understand it. There's lots of different reasons for that, or different characterizations of that. What's going on, do you think? Why is it happening? And has it ever been seen before?
Yeah, I don't know if anything has ever been seen before to this scale. So the virus was very threatening at the beginning of the pandemic, and maybe returned to be threatening during the second wave. There has been the requirement for us to be in lockdown and isolated, which is really a unique experience, because in previous pandemics, from my understanding, be they 1918 to 1920, or 1957 to 60, 67 to 70, the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu, there was no lockdown. And so the lockdown is such an unusual experience. It's almost a sort of collective agoraphobic type experience, whereby we end up being months at home, isolated from those around us. This will compound anxieties, will increase the level of threat monitoring, will increase the levels of low mood, and as I mentioned in the past, there is a multiplier effect from the sort of messaging in the environment. So this inconsistent or mixed messaging about risks. It's going away. It's coming back. It's much worse than we thought. There's a new variant. All this mixed messaging together with this collective avoidance will have increased the threat response massively. And so if we're in that state of threat, we try desperately to hang on to some form of safety. And that avoidance, the worry, the watching the news regularly will serve a purpose of giving us a sense of control. Well, I'm not getting ill because I'm not leaving the house.
I don't like to use the word blame, and it doesn't really, it's a very difficult thing to do. But why do you think we've had, okay, there's been mixed messaging, but where does that come from? The media, government, the adverts, the actual science, as it evolved? You know, we had to keep informing people of the new variant. I'm
sure, Lucy, it's a combination of all these factors that you identified. It's not my direct area of expertise, the sort of the side to do with virology, epidemiology, but I'm sure that people didn't know what was going on. So a degree of intermittent or mixed messaging was to be expected. But I'm also sure that the government was probably concerned about ensuring that people would adhere to certain behaviors. And I think there is some evidence that messaging was planned in such a way as to maximize adherence to these behaviors.
Can you think of any specific message, any particular adverts or anything you saw with your experience and expertise that you think may have increased the feeling of a threat to people? Yeah. Just any examples?
Yeah, one messaging that stuck to my mind, and I'm not sure whether similar messaging was sort of displayed or occurring outside the UK, is that messaging where you have typically an elderly individual who is dying, and an implicit or explicit message about the responsibility of this death being potentially yours. So I think that kind of messaging is very powerful, but will come with a cost. And the cost will be a very, very heightened threat and responsibility response from the individual who's witnessing that message.
How could it been done differently? If you had, if you could sort of rewrite it, I mean, it could be argued, and I have heard behavioral scientists tell me that there was no messaging, fear-based messaging, and they really believe that, and that the fear that people experience was fear of a virus, and in any pandemic that would happen. So would there be any other way of trying to get people to adhere to stay-at-home messages or whatever we did, restrictions, without using that? Is there a better way of doing it?
Well, the answer is I don't know, because this particular area is not my area of expertise. But I would have assumed that a lockdown would have been sufficient. So already ensuring that nobody leaves their homes is a very sort of draconian intervention from a social point of view. Would there have been a need on a sort of an additive need of telling us that things are on a daily basis, that things are catastrophic and that there are new variants? I'm not sure that it would have been needed. I think simply telling people, look, you need to stay home for a certain period of time because we maybe need to get control over what's happening in the NHS, for example, and manage patient numbers. I think that would have been sufficient. I don't know why it had to be compounded by messages of fear. I don't know if they would have been.
Public health has always been about guidance, support, and education. That's always been in the book. It's never been about coercion and about criminalization and threat. So it is a new thing. So maybe that played into it. I mean, what in the day-to-day life, what kind of features characterize someone with COVID anxiety syndrome? What sort of things are they doing that may impair their ability to sort of function in life?
Yeah, well, we know that the most recent data indicates that being vaccinated doesn't appear to make a difference as to whether the syndrome is present or not, i.e., there are individuals who are vaccinated who are continuing to avoid and worry and check and clean, etc. So those kinds of behaviors are clear. We're walking down the road knowing full well that transmission is very, very unlikely, even if we're not wearing masks, and people sort of jump out of the way. Sometimes you wonder, why are they doing it? They look very young and healthy. The chances of anything happening to them is very small. You have reports of individuals continuously following news in some at the cost, at the detriment of their work. For example, that's
today
one of the.
We've recorded for the first time 0 COVID deaths. We have numbers that are tiny. Is it surely not something that will dissipate as the news, with time and as people?
So exactly. Hopefully, for the vast majority of individuals, this will dissipate. But because it's been going on for a long time, 12, 14, 15 months of lockdown times mixed messaging, we are concerned that it might be a number of people, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%, who just become stuck. And what happens is that even if you tell them that the virus is gone, even if you tell them, that the virus is endemic, or you tell them that the variants, there are thousands of them and they're meaningless, they will have acquired and practiced these behaviors to such a point where abandoning them causes terrible anxiety. So being together in a theater and suddenly somebody coughing in October or November next to you, even if rationally you know that that's unlikely to affect you, you've been vaccinated, the virus is endemic, the idea of not leaving the theater or of not washing one's hands is so terrifying that life becomes limited. And on top of that, our biggest concern is that the attention to threat, the avoidance, the worry, the checking, this syndrome features will then escalate into another psychological problem, such as health anxiety, OCD, and that it will be modeled to young people. So maybe very young children of individuals who are suffering in inverted commas from the syndrome will model the unhelpful behavior
of the parent.
Yes.
So at the moment, what do you think the scale of the problem is? And have you any idea what we might be left with as a residue, as the months go on and some people start to feel more confident? What is the scale now, do you think?
So the scale of the problem is very big, significant, according to our latest data. So our latest data from March and April paints a picture that approximately 1 in 10, between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 individuals are stuck in this syndrome, i.e., these behaviors are very expensive emotionally for them.
Yeah.
We have looked at data across other countries where the lockdowns have been eased beforehand, data that I will share with you in 3 weeks' time. And in countries where the lockdowns had been eased well before the UK, around about 10 to 15% of people were still displaying the syndrome. So these are countries that have not been locked up, but had the virus they've not been locked up or in lockdown,
So does that not suggest that it's less about messaging and more about the virus? I mean, other countries, did they use the same tactics that we did? Is that not? Oh, and I suppose social media is another driver, perhaps.
Yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know what other countries have done. I know that in some European countries, the messaging about the the dangers of the virus are relentless.
Right.
From anecdotal evidence.
Yeah.
They are continuous. Social media may have been a route to, especially probably at the beginning of the pandemic, that may have fueled anxiety.
Yeah.
Maybe in that demographic of young people who may use it more.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to be left with a significant number of individuals who are going to be stuck. And my concern is October, November, December, when we might have variants. Why wouldn't we have them? It's a natural progression. Or what happens if we have other respiratory viruses that mimic? Well, they're all very similar.
Well, they may be
mimic
packed up, and they may
COVID. What's going to happen to those who will have avoided for a year and a half?
So, what should people do if they have? They start to recognize that they may be one of those people. How do they overcome it?
In the same way that one would overcome any other anxiety problem. So behaviorally and cognitively. Behaviorally would mean returning to what we do what we used to do in a graded way. So going out, mixing with people, maybe outside to begin with.
Should people be anxious now at all? Should people be anxious now at all? Would you go into a football stadium of people? Would you be quite unanxious?
From a personal point of view, yes, I would be. Especially stadiums, they're open. I would have no anxiety personally.
I mean, I know it's not your field, but what should people be anxious about? People are anxious. I know they are, and they're still moving to the side of the path. That's not appropriate. But is there something, is there a level of anxiety that should be acceptable at this point?
I would turn around the question and say, how much more avoidance, worry, and checking do people need to do in order to stay safe? So the anxiety will be with us for a long time. Do I feel uncomfortable in certain situations? Yes, I do, because I'm not used to being that close to people as I used to once be, and as we were all once much closer to each other physically and socially. What do I do with that anxiety is the question. So if I start to avoid, if I start to overcheck, I will never come out of it, because there will be another wave of viruses. So that will come our way, as they always come in autumn and winter. So for me, the point here is not to rationalize the anxiety or the fear. The point is to let go of the control and find out. I've been vaccinated. I am 35 years old. Chances are very, very small of anything happening to me. How will I find that out? How will I return to normal? By not avoiding anymore, by not checking anymore, by not washing the hands anymore, except in a sort of reasonable way, like my grandmother used to say, before dinner time, 3-4 times a day, not 30 times a day.
Yeah.
So that's the answer, is really not in rationalizing the anxiety, but in giving up the control.
Do you think Italy fueled the sort of anxiety last year when there were images coming through? Do you think that was fueled by the media? Yes. If
you want to scare people, fear is acquired in many different ways and manners. Modeling is one. When, as in not catwalk modeling, obviously, but modeling other people's behaviors and responses. And another way of acquiring fear is through information. So the images of individuals dying, the ambulances, will inevitably have increased the collective fear levels significantly. And on top of that, if we start telling people, be particularly careful, scan the environment for the virus. Yeah, that was another message. It
was alert, wasn't it? Be alert.
Stay alert. And the problem is, how do you stay alert? Is he coughing? Is she sneezing? Do they look pale and ill? how do you know that somebody is ill or not? How do you stay alert? And you can see that this messaging has fueled directly the syndrome, because one of the 4 facets of the syndrome is sort of attention to threat, monitoring other people's symptoms, which for a period over the last year we were asked to do. Stay alert.
Does that have a neurological? Has anyone looked at the brain? Does that increase wiring in a certain direction or light up certain parts of the brain? So what happens biologically?
If you want to incubate anxiety in people, what you do is you get them to worry, to avoid, and to check. So we know that worrying, if done regularly and in a repeated fashion, will bring to an increase in fear and anxiety. In fact, it's the royal road to anxiety, and we tend to acquire patterns of worrying when we're very young, between the ages of 5 and 12. And by the time we're teenagers, they're automatic behaviors,
Really?
sort of software. So I think over the last year, we've been inundated with messages to do with worrying, and may have acquired the behavior.
But I'd really love to pick up on that point about children. Not only have they been inundated with these messages or watching or aping parental behavior, but also they've been locked away in bedrooms, haven't they, for a year and kept apart from their peer groups and other people. What legacy might that have in that generation? It's fairly experimental. We perhaps...
Yes, the legacy is multifaceted. So we know that there will be a legacy to do with learning. They won't have been able to learn in the social manner that you and I did.
What sort of things do you think?
From what I was actually talking to a few teachers recently out of curiosity, and they've noticed, and I'm sure that we can find evidence to support this, they've noticed, difficulties in language development. Because so much language acquisition is through social interaction at school.
What sort of ages are you talking?
Between the ages of 3 and 6. One teacher was telling me, for example.
Yeah, I've heard this. Yeah.
Then there is the modeling of anxious behaviors, such as washing hands. And you can see now that their children that go around, touch something, they immediately take the sanitizer out. Then there is patterns of worrying and overthinking, because children will have sort of, like sponges, absorb that feeling in the environment of threat. Then there is the avoidance. So I think it's been bad enough for people in their sort of adult years or teenage years. We don't know how bad it's going to be for younger people, especially if it continues in this intermittent fashion where there is openings and closing, and closings, which could go on for
indefinite.
A year, 2 years, who knows?
Yeah, we don't know. So with that, what can be done? I mean, even in the schools, they're actually perpetuating it. You see little children in nursery with red raw hands because they keep sanitizing. I know there's actually no evidence really that the hand sanitizers make any difference to the viral spread, but that carries on. So even we just do a lot of things without evidence, don't we? Just do something, mask, just do something.
So maybe
what can be done to stop it? Yeah.
So you're right that we've taken on a variety of these behaviors, which are in a way part of the syndrome, that we've now realized have got absolutely no evidence base. One of them is the continuous cleaning of hands. And as you're right, you're seeing in school sanitization going on when we know full well that the impact of transmission through hands is very small. The transmission of children to adults, from what I understand, there are several studies, is quite limited. Again, it's not my area of expertise, but I have a decent understanding of statistics and methodology. And so why are we continuing? Because that's going to create a series of maladaptive, obsessional type behaviors that might last a lifetime. You might meet that same person when they're 25 or 30 years old and say, why are you washing your hands all the time? Why are you doing X? Why are you avoiding Y? They won't even remember why.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
So
they won't remember.
What do we need to do now? Would it be an idea for the government machine, which I know they've spent quite a bit of money on in, trying to keep us in lockdown, to try and turn that round and help people who, I mean, you didn't actually say what you thought the scale of the problem was at the moment, but I remember you saying something like 1 in 10, or is it hard?
Yeah, it will depend by demographic.
Yes.
So I think it's plausible to assume that those who are high risk and elderly might really be affected by this, but a lot of young people also. It's almost curvilinear. I think the most affected are the young and those who are maybe elderly or have a risk.
But
maybe
overall proportion, how many people, per 100 or per 10, what proportion of people? I think we said, did you say about 1 in 10, or is that hard?
It could be 1 in 10. It could be even 1 in 5.
Okay.
The latest data indicated 1 in 5, but we need to reassess the numbers after the lockdown has been lifted, because we're assuming that some will let go of these maladaptive behaviors.
Yeah.
What can be done? Well, why can we not now start focusing on safety rather than threat, as we had discussed in the past? Why can't we have messages about the fact that infection to fatality rate is extremely low, and that for certain demographics, we now know after 12 or 14 months that it is very, very, very close to zero? Why can't we have messages that show the risk of dying of COVID versus other risks in life, such as crossing the road or taking an airplane? Okay. And on top of that, why don't we have a review of all these sort of safety behaviors that we've taken on that have become redundant? So do children really need masks at school? Do they need to wash their hands continuously? I am not the person that can say whether they should or not, but I'm sure that there are people that can review the evidence and have found, as we discussed, without shadow of doubt, that some of these safety behaviors are redundant. So why not abandon them?
Well, I suppose it depends who reviews the evidence, because there are some people that are looking very, with a magnifying glass, as it were, at the R number and saying, well, we must do everything for any marginal gain, even if there may not be any, because we've got to keep that R number down, rather than looking at the costs of this and of the measures which you're describing. And I mean, this is just one of many costs, presumably, of lockdowns. And that's the big, there's no one actually tasked with looking at these harms. I mean, what are you likely to do with your research when you've completed it? Are you likely to publish?
Yes, I mean, we will continue to publish papers and try and make recommendations that will support individuals in identifying whether they're stuck in frankly coping behaviors that are redundant, and B, and I've had, actually, Lucy, we've had 2 or 3 people over the last week that have contacted us from the NHS, because they've come across individuals who've been vaccinated or very low risk who cannot return to normal, even if they're allowed to, in part, to return to normal.
How does that manifest for them?
And so they are in a difficult situation because there's no diagnostic label for them.
Right.
They can't call the condition or the problem obsessive compulsive disorder. They can't call it generalized anxiety. They can't call it depression. It's not really a phobia. So they've asked us, how can we help them? And the message is, for me, fundamental. This message is, this COVID anxiety syndrome is a pandemic-related phenomenon.
Right.
The last thing we want is to label it as a psychiatric problem. We should tell people who are coming for help that it's understandable that this problem has emerged because of the fact we're in lockdown, because the messaging may have been threatening, because the virus was threatening at the beginning, but that now it's important to let go of these behaviors in a graded way, so that we avoid the development of what one day might be called obsessive compulsive disorder, health anxiety. And so what we're trying to do with this NHS staff that has contacted us in psychological services is provide some basic information about the syndrome, tranquilize in a way individuals, to reduce the fears they have, to normalize it, and to gradually accompany them, which I've been doing with some patients myself or clients myself, to gradually allow them to retest what it means to return to normal, to exercise the social muscle, to find out that you can go to a pub and you're not going to get ill, etc. Because if you never test it, if you never test the fear, you'll remain locked for the rest of your life in some form or other.
So it doesn't echo any other problems. It's not like OCD. It's not the same. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, these people were anxious anyway. These are the sort of people that would have.
Well, our latest 2 studies tell us very clearly that a history of mental health problems does not predict the syndrome.
So it's not, why not? Why did we don't know why everyone didn't get this? I didn't get it.
We know there will be difference to do with personality, some differences to do with underlying levels of health anxiety. It will also be to do with how much at risk one is from the illness, if somebody has been lost, maybe a relative or a friend. So it's sort of multifactorial, the explanation.
Yeah.
And Lucy, it's very categorical. We have around about 30-40% of the people who score very highly, and then the other 60% who are in the category that you are in.
Yeah.
They're not particularly concerned. You may have adhered to lockdown, you've heard the messages, but you're not particularly anxious. But I presume, Lucy, it's because you don't worry much, because you focus on safety rather than threat. So on infection to fatality, on the improving situation. You're probably not still washing things that you bought locally, and you're not avoiding. So obviously there's a category of people, by the way, this is an important fact that escaped me earlier on, that it seems that individuals who are in what we can call sort of blue collar jobs, who have not been able to stay home and work, display a lot less COVID anxiety syndrome than individuals who are white-collar workers. Am I getting it right? I always confused. Who are white-collar workers and who are more educated.
Yeah. So, in fact, even if you're a professor of virology, you may still have this syndrome. It doesn't discriminate between intelligence, understanding of risk. It could affect anyone. Is that part of what you're saying?
Lucy, I'll resist the temptation. I don't know when it comes to intelligence, whether intelligence is a discriminatory sort of variable. But in terms of education, we found that there is actually a correlation with the level of education. So it appears that those who are more educated are more anxious.
Yeah, yeah. So it may be, something to do with, because the people that had to take the risk were, well, people who were poorer, and that's where the virus affected the most vulnerable in the end.
They may have not had a choice and had to continue to take public transport. They had to continue to, work on a building site. They had to continue to go to the restaurant and prepare the takeaways. So they were exposed to the fear and risk, and may have learned that in actual fact, the objective dangers of the virus are far lower than what
people writing the rules at home would maybe have us say. Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of relevant this week. We've got the June the 21st reopening, which is now under threat again. I know it's not your area of expertise, but what will that do to the psyche if we've had another sort of promise, like a present, we can do this if you behave, if you follow these rules, we can reopen, and then there's now another variant. I mean, what will that do to people, do you think, if they say, no, we've got to wait again?
It's that 5-letter word, mixed. Mixed messaging. The problem with mixed messaging is twofold. There is initially an increase in anxiety, an increase in fear, We don't know whether the virus is as dangerous as we think it is. There's a new variant. But another cost of mixed messaging is learned helplessness. And learned helplessness is where you start, thinking, well, nothing is going to change. If this is done now, then God knows what's going to happen in October. And you gradually become depressed because you feel you have no control anymore, no capacity to plan, no capacity to prepare yourself. I'm just wondering, people who own pubs, people who work in the sort of entertainment industry, what will they think if they get another postponement? They basically enter a depressive state.
Yeah. And I suppose the financial impact, it could be someone in a high rise or whatever, can't pay their rent. There's the moratorium on evictions runs out, doesn't it, as well? So those things, perhaps we haven't really had that. We've kind of had an anesthetic to all the financial pressure, which is linked to suicide and suicidal ideation and depression. But that's kind of been, under a kind of morphine haze with the furlough scheme. So there's other threats looming. Yeah,
and there is that, and also the one we're aware of, which is all the people who haven't received treatment for other conditions.
Yes.
The elderly who have lost social contact, that we know is fundamental. It's fundamentally protective to them for problems such as dementia, etc. So I think the costs over the next 3, 5, 6, 7 years will be so significant, but they are not coming all in one go.
Yeah,
they're going to come in other waves.
Yeah, I mean, I just did want to touch on it, but because your expertise is addiction, there has been a sort of uptick in people who drinking more. Is that right? And other
yes. So during the lockdown, for example, last year, the sort of initial one, and I think the pattern hasn't changed. There were broadly two responses with respect to addictive behaviors. You had the over 45, 50s who had a marginal increase in addictive behaviors, around about maybe 10, 15% in alcohol use. And then you had the under 40s, under 35, especially women, who witness very significant increase, for example, in alcohol use, apart from increases in anxiety. So again, there is this very separate categorical response to the lockdown. Very little effect or marginal effect when it comes to addictive behaviors for one group, determined predominantly by age, above 45, 50, and a sort of a very maladaptive response for the under 30s, 35, 40s, and especially women. Right. So, and I think that pattern was broadly similar in the following lockdowns. This was a big study that Ipsos Mori undertook in April 2020. And but overall, we know that during COVID, across all addictive behaviors, so if you add into the mix behavioral addictions, so gambling, technology, social media, if it's not used in a controlled manner, they overall, there has been a significant increase, and the studies are coming through now.
Really fascinating.
Yeah, because it's data looking at sort of pre and post.
Yeah.
Over the last 12, 18 months.
Is it mostly people who already had a predisposition or already had some addictive behaviors, or is it also a whole new cohort of people that?
Yeah, really difficult still at the stage to give that kind of answer. Why? Because some of the studies were also rushed as things were happening, and maybe not all variables were controlled for. Certainly for those who had a problem with addictions, the situation will have, for the majority, exacerbated the problem.
We've had more alcohol-related deaths, haven't we, last year? Yeah. So people drinking very, very heavily, yeah.
That's right. So, and that will have also included individuals who not necessarily had a problem, but maybe they lost a person or could not tolerate the level of isolation imposed by the lockdown and used alcohol or other addictions as a form of self-medication, and that may have gone out of control. So will we know? The only way we can know really is in those studies that monitored behavior prior to the pandemic. But people were not warned in October 2019. Collect data now. Well, there is a study actually that I reviewed recently that is about to be published that showed that levels of trauma in the general population, so not in those who were anxious before, had increased by around about 20-25%. So it was very traumatic, the pandemic.
Using criteria of pandemic?
Of PTSD, basically. Really? And they had monitored and showed that for a large number of individuals, they had retracted over the last few months, but for a certain number, it had remained. So a similar argument to the COVID-19 anxiety syndrome. People were traumatized and they started avoiding, worrying, etc. Many had sort of managed to ride the wave over the last year, but a significant number had become stuck, in sort of trauma-like responses.
So I'm talking to you as if you're magic because you understand about the human brain. But I mean, if we had told people there is a virus which will affect people seriously in a certain demographic with, predicting, or those with predictable underlying factors, we'd like you to do this, this, and this. Do you think the population would have done that? That was one big argument at the start. And I know there was Professor Neil Ferguson was saying, well, we're not Sweden. We wouldn't do what Sweden did. We don't, we don't behave like that in England. Do you think that people would have done? Would they have respected that? Or is it impossible to know?
So there is a degree of impossibility of knowing, but, or maybe it's categorical, either can or cannot know. But I don't know whether there is that much evidence, and it's not my area, that those outside Sweden wouldn't have behaved in responsible ways. I think there is counter evidence that a lot of people, if told to stay home and make sure that they don't meet those who are vulnerable, diabetic, elderly, would have probably done that.
Yeah.
And compounding the lockdowns with the fear messaging we got will have a cost that we're going to live through for months and years to come.